The first encounter took place on a streetcar, a few days shy of Christmas. He was burrowing his fleshy nose further into a newspaper, unaware that the streetcar had already reached a stop. I touched his shoulder, pointed to the window, and said, "You need to get off." He pushed his way through the crowded car and jumped off right behind me. "Thank you," he said. "I would have missed my stop. You've really helped me out." Soft, downy snow was falling quietly on the streets, like feathers plucked from some fabulous swan bird. On days like this, I never felt like going home. I broke the silence, telling him I already knew who he was. We live on the same floor, in the same building, and ride on the same streetcar a couple times a week. He's never noticed me, of course. Grown-ups are terribly self-centered. They only pay attention to other grown-ups. So he was surprised, and I could tell he didn't really know how to behave with me or what to say to me. We walked on in silence, and in front of our building, I remarked casually, "You know, you haven't told me your name." It was Rudolph. I couldn't suppress my giggle when I heard it, as I thought only circus elephants could have that name. But when he heard my name was Io, he roared with laughter and revenge, rocking back and forth on his heels. Closing my door behind me, I asked him, "Well, now will you recognize me on the streetcar?" He said he would without a doubt. A few weeks passed after our initial encounter. The city seemed to have cast off its dull winter shroud, abandoning it like smoke to the wind. The heady, pungent smell of approaching spring lingered in the air as the sun's scales had finally tipped away from wintry extreme. Rudolph went away for business. I called his apartment almost nightly to catch his return, learning the rather unpleasant news that he had a wife. Then one warm day, I showed up at Rudolph's apartment. It was noontime, and he was there alone, washing the floors. "Io, what are you doing here?" he exclaimed. I declared that from now on, whenever we were together, we formed a single entity, Rudolfio. Rudolph and Io, put them together and you get Rudolfio, just like an Italian. We were to address each other as so. With a flicker of amusement in his eyes, he repeated after me. I sat down in the armchair in his living room and watched him as he got down on his knees and continued scrubbing the floor. I interrupted the peaceful scene with a sudden outburst. "Why did you have to get married so early? If only you'd waited another 2 years, I could have married you." But he told me not to be in a hurry to get married, and that one day I'll meet some fine young man. "But I'd rather marry you," I told him. He assured me I'd meet someone 1,000 times better. "Let's forget about all this and have some tea," he suggested with a placating smile, speaking to me as if I were a clinging child. "Rudolfio, I think I'd better go now," I told him. In my room, I lay on my bed, sprawling my limbs to reach for the edges. I felt sad as an empty house, overtaken by some vague melancholy which I could not yet define, but which was real nonetheless. That year, spring came and went suddenly, almost without warning. Outside my bedroom window stood a giant magnolia tree. In the short span of 2 weeks, its pointy green buds unfurled, bloomed into a pink cloud, and became a fragrant carpet that engulfed the sidewalk. Rudolfio again went away on business, and I didn't see him for a long time. The last time I called his house, his wife answered the phone. She was dismissive and told me if I were calling to ask for help with one of my algebra problems, I'd do better to ask my math teacher. I hung up the phone, wishing I could grow up overnight like the magnolia tree. Finally, we met by chance on the streetcar. I felt someone touch my shoulder, and seeing that it was him, Rudolfio, I was happily flustered. The car was packed so tightly with commuters that my head touched his chin. When I looked up at him to say something and he lowered his head to listen, our faces were so close that he averted his eyes. "Rudolfio, do you want me to tell you something?" "Of course," he said. "I've been thinking about you the whole time." He said, "That's really silly of me." With a sigh, I told him, "I know, but it's not as though I were always thinking about someone. I've never felt a thing for any of the boys I know." The streetcar stopped and we got off. Rudolfio suggested we go for a walk along the river. It was a large, open area littered with debris. There was no path, so he took my hand as I skipped over obstacles. The whole time I was silent, gripped by some powerful, aching, and uncontrollable emotion. We came out onto a steep bank. Unable to hold back any longer, I said to him, "Rudolfio, no one has ever kissed me, not even once." He leaned over and kissed me on the cheek. "On the lips," I begged him. "Only people who are very close kiss on the lips," he told me. "Aren't we close, Rudolfio?" I waited, trembling, as disappointment stewed and turned into stone. I slapped him hard across the face and ran back in the direction we had come from, back through the pile of debris, back under the stretch of sky that nursed my anticipation and desire. He stood like an oak and watched, without running after or calling out to me. This happened on Saturday. On Sunday morning, he showed up in my room. Earlier, my mother had called him in a panic, explaining to him that I hadn't come home the night before and that something was wrong. I was sitting on my bed with my legs tucked under me, rocking my body back and forth as I gazed out the window. "Rudolfio!" he shouted. I turned in his direction but said nothing. "Rudolfio!" he tried once more. "Stop it," I said with a look of disgust. "You're no Rudolfio. You're just the most ordinary Rudolph. The most ordinary Rudolph. Do you understand?" My unconcealed spite gave him a start. He walked towards the window and leaned heavily on the sill. A moment later, he relented. "Well, okay, but at least tell me where you've been all night." "Go to hell," I replied wearily. Then he nodded, picked up his frock coat, and went to hell.